everyone, and welcome to the Vegas Legal Magazine podcast. I'm Mark Fierro with Vegas Legal Magazine publisher Tyler Morgan. Joining us today, Fierro Communications Vice President Jeff Haney. Thank you so much for joining us. We see it all around us. We hear about the tragic stories all the time, and nearly every one of us has a loved one who's been affected by it. The opioid epidemic gripping the nation, and the devastation being wrought by the likes of OxyContin, other opiates, fentanyl, and even heroin. Our guest today, David Marlon, the CEO of Solutions Recovery in Las Vegas, is a leader in the field of addiction and recovery. At Solutions Recovery, he's dedicated to the vital mission of helping people who are struggling with addiction get on the road to recovery and rebuilding their lives. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
You know, they say these drugs come in cycles. We saw the whole cocaine thing hit back in the 60s. It had everything to do with hallucinogenics. Pot has always been with us. How does this current, the opioid epidemic, how does it stack up against all of the other things that you've seen throughout your career?
Well, it's interesting. I've been in healthcare for over 30 years in Southern Nevada. For the last 13, directly running Solutions Recovery, which is now part of the largest rehab in Las Vegas. And I watched a progression when we opened 13 years ago to treating alcohol, meth, cocaine, some opiates, to a gradual progression where now more than half the people who call us are calling us with an opiate dependency. One of the big differences between something like methamphetamine or cocaine, which are both psychologically addicting, opiates are both psychologically addicting and physiologically addicting. So our clients, they need this every single day. It's not something they just do on weekends like some of the cocaine users.
You know, I want to put this in perspective because it was just a few years ago that police really had no experience with fentanyl whatsoever. They just had not come across it. And to give you an idea of the power, to give our listeners an idea of the power of this drugs, police would go in searches and go, I think I found something, and drop dead because they had touched it and it's transdermal. It's that powerful. Now it's being synthesized in China. It's one of the cheapest drugs out there, isn't it? The most available, cheapest drug.
It is. And another big difference that I've seen in Las Vegas is that when I opened Solutions over 13 years ago, it was helping people get clean and sober. Now, we're really trying to have people not die. The amount of deaths that are occurring in Las Vegas are astounding. It makes me sick how many texts, calls, whether it's ex-patients or people trying to get in who are overdosing. It's really reached epidemic proportions.
What is the makeup of the current addictive opiate scene? I mean, Mark mentioned fentanyl. You hear a lot about OxyContin. You even hear a lot about heroin. What is your patients? What are they currently struggling with? What is that looking like in the current modern day environment?
You know, it's interesting. I've gone into dozens of schools in Clark County, and I have a 1-hour presentation that they've let me do, and I've done it in Green Valley High School. I've done it in Palo Verde. Well, I'll sit and I'll ask the administration to turn around and not look. And I'll ask kids who's been offered an Oxy, a Roxy, or a Hydro in the last 30 days. And about 80% of the kids raise their hand. And when I talk about Oxys, I mean oxycodone or OxyContin. When I say Roxy, I mean Roxaset. And when I say hydrocodone, that's the third. And very frequently, it's people trying a pill orally, or maybe they're crushing it and snorting it, or perhaps they're putting a pill on some foil, and they're using a pen or a tube to inhale the vapor from the pill. It's very frequently starting there. And unfortunately, the person who you're going to buy pills from, when you go and you're low on money, they'll often then switch and say, you'll get the same thing if you use this opium, or if you use this heroin. And when they say opium, they don't mean opium. They mean heroin, but they're trying to say something that sounds less dangerous. And they'll often encourage folks to smoke it, so you don't lead them right from taking a pill, which is a prescription safe, to something you're going to IV inject. And then after you are smoking it for a month, you're developing tolerance, you're not able to absorb it as well, you don't get as good of a high, then you go to that same person and they'll help tie you off and teach you how to inject it. And although I haven't done it, I've heard this hundreds of times, this progression.
Well, that's an important point. And when we were growing up, we mostly thought of a heroin addict as maybe a broken down junkie with a needle somewhere, or Lenny Bruce hitting rock bottom in a bathroom or something. But this idea that you can smoke it or snort it, I guess that must be a huge game changer in your field.
It is. Now it's a 19-year-old, formerly a student, from Summerlin or Green Valley.
What's the average age range of, who's your typical patient that you see mostly?
When I opened Solutions, I was hoping to become the treatment center for local executives. I'm the treatment center for the kids of local executives. It's 20 to 30 is a lot of our clients. Although we recently had an 82-year-old come in, and we do treat patients from 18 to north of 80, but 20 to 30 years old is most of our clients.
And what's the percentage of those patients that come in that treat with you that stay clean or relapse?
That's a great question. That's really the million-dollar question. And we have a variety of outcome studies that we perform. The rough answer is we've published a study that had 65% of our clients who stayed engaged in treatment with us reach the 1-year sobriety mark. Part of the problem with that is in a verbal report that we've done following up with the clients. We're trying to do some studies where we encourage the clients to come back in and take a blood test because we're looking to get better outcomes data. But that's a big challenge in the drug and alcohol treatment, because if we call our clients and they tell us they're clean, there is a question with those statistics.
Yeah, you're just taking them for their word. What we were talking about before we went on air about the whole Demi Lovato incident, and I think when I was reading the article, it was saying that she was 8 years sober, and then all of a sudden just relapsed. And I've never known anybody closely that has dealt with a drug issue, and especially opioids and things of that nature. But what is typically that trigger that gets somebody to go from years of sobriety and not touching anything to just one day they just fall off the wagon and they just go full tilt?
It was interesting. I was asked this morning, they said, nobody could have seen this coming. And Demi had tweeted back in March that she had 6 years clean. And then in June, she released a hit song called Sober, where she talked about how that she was no longer sober and that she was drinking again. And now, just over a month since she released the song, she's had this overdose. And it sounds like a poly-use situation where there was discussion of multiple drugs as well as alcohol. Now, unfortunately, addiction is a lifelong chronic illness. And if someone suffers from addiction and they get treated for it, we could get them to alleviate or arrest all the symptoms of their addiction. But unless they're working on a recovery program, or they're staying engaged in some kind of treatment, or they're addressing their disease, there's a high likelihood for relapse. Just like they would if a person was found to have diabetes, and if after 6 years they stopped taking their diabetes medicine, there'd be a high likelihood that they would need to see a professional again to treat their disease.
When you say working on the recovery program, what exactly does that entail? Are there different approaches? Is there one particular approach that you embrace among above the others, or how does that work?
I am adamant that there's all different approaches, that each person who comes to see us is an individual. Some folks gravitate towards a 12-step fellowship like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, and those help many people. But they're also not right for some folks. Some folks gravitate to their spiritual institution, and they'll go to something like Celebrate Recovery or integrate with their church. Others get immersed in working out, or perhaps work into a family system that's encouraging and supportive. Others might dig deeply into their work. And each person's different, and I don't believe that me here can prescribe what's the right system of recovery for someone else.
I'm on the board of trustees of Samaritan House, and
God bless you.
You feel two things when you stand there and hold those guys' hands and say the Lord's Prayer. And one is there's tremendous power in that room. There's tremendous power in that prayer that I never felt before until you're standing there with somebody who's been on that edge. There's that power. And there is a dread fear. No matter how long they have been sober, it's as if they are being stalked every day.
Yeah, we each get a daily reprieve. It's one day at a time.
What size this up? Size this. I read Clapton's autobiography, and I thought there was something very telling in there. He decides, this is before his son is born, he decides that he's not going to have a son who's going to have a father who's an alcoholic heroin addict. And so he says, I'm going to stop heroin. And stops heroin and says, it wasn't like in the movies. I got sick. I didn't feel good. He goes, I felt like I had the flu or something like. It felt terrible, but nobody needed to chain me down or anything like that. So a couple of weeks go by, and he decides he's going to quit alcohol, and he dies. That's just it. He just falls on his face. Cement hits him in the head. When he wakes up, his wife is screaming, "Eric, you died. This paramedic just brought you back," and he's sitting in an ambulance. I think because it's legal and it's always been part of our lives, people don't understand the real threat that alcohol poses. Put that in perspective, if you would, with some of these other drugs.
That's a great question, and it also goes to the acute nature of our clients, and that I have dozens of nurses, full-time RNs, physicians, psychiatrists, technicians who are watching our clients. We recently just installed a system where underneath the mattress pads of our beds in our detox center, we actually can read the vitals. So I could check the blood pressure, the respiration of clients. So during the night, if a client got a substance, maybe some fentanyl, and then took it and didn't tell us, so we could actually track and help keep our clients safe. Similarly, if two patients walk in, and one is a heavy IV heroin user, and another is an alcoholic. If I talk to both patients, and the alcoholic says, well, I haven't had a drink in 2 days, I'm going to get the alcoholic into the doctor first, even though the heroin addict might be hurting more, because with alcohol, there's a 1 in 3 seizure risk and a potential adverse event. Wow. So our business is really medical, and it's very important that we're addressing our clients' lives and need to keep them safe medically. And alcohol is a very dangerous drug to detox from.
Yeah, I've always been intrigued by alcohol addiction because that's one of the addictions that, alcohol is legal. So when you're recovering from alcohol, it's difficult. I would imagine how difficult it could be to go into the regular world and socialize around people who can, drink socially and control themselves, and a former alcoholic having to be there and deal with that temptation on a regular basis. You have alcohol just constantly.
Everywhere.
You go to the grocery store. I mean, it's in front of you. It's not like heroin or other drugs where you actually have to kind of go be sneaky
make
and
somewhat
seek
of an effort,
out.
yeah.
Yeah. So I got to imagine the relapse and the dedication to the recovery on alcohol has just got to be tremendous.
I am a recovering alcoholic. I have just over 13 years clean. Wow. And, my wife, she went out last night. We were downtown on Fremont, and she had a drink. And it is not a challenge for me at all. I like my first sponsor used a story with me. He said, Dave, if I was allergic to strawberries, or if you were allergic to strawberries and I had a strawberry, would it bother you? And I'd say, no, I wouldn't want to take one because I don't want my throat to swell up and I don't want to die. I just look at it as an allergy. I'm allergic to alcohol. I might joke that I break out in handcuffs. so I choose to not drink.
That's an interesting analogy. Never thought of it that way.
When following up on Mark's earlier point, when someone like Demi Lovato was in the news because of her tragic incident, I think it brings a lot of these issues to the forefront of people's minds, and maybe prompts them to address some of the events. And I know some of the reports involving her incident mentioned that they use an anti-opiate injection, some sort of drug that stops the effects of opiates, and maybe even it can save lives in some instances, and maybe even saved her life. What do you know about that? What went on there, and what kind of anti-opiate drug did they use, and how common is that?
They use Narcan. Many of my staff carry it. I've seen Narcan being used. I haven't personally used it, although to me, I'm surprised. It is a drug that reverses the effects of opiates, and it is very effective. I believe our EMTs, our police, our fire use it multiple times every day in this valley. And, unfortunately, it is very effective in reversing an overdose. One of the problems with it is the client then almost goes right into withdrawal. And right after they're revived, they really want their drug again. So it's a really vicious cycle.
We hear about a lot of fights breaking out in the back of ambulances because of that, because you just stole $30 high off this person, and they're dying. I wasn't dying. I'm fine.
Right.
How important? It sounds as if the next level of treatment is using drugs to help get people off of drugs. Before, it was methadone, and then there was methadone, and that was it. But that's actually, there's a whole new view of that, isn't there?
There is, and medication-assisted treatment is a really important component of treatment. It's not a replacement. So if someone develops a hydrocodone dependency, the answer isn't give them buprenorphine and we're done. The answer is there's a whole counseling process to help people understand what happened, deal with root causes, address coping mechanisms, heal, and utilize things like buprenorphine, use things like naltrexone. Now, buprenorphine is a partial agonist, so it shows up similar to an opiate, stops withdrawal, is often taken sublingually. Things like naltrexone is actually a full blockade and is not an opiate at all, and they both have similar efficacies as far as long-term recovery rates in treating opiate dependence. But there's a host of other drugs out there as well. For many years, for alcoholism, they've used antabuse. And antabuse is an aversion therapy, so if you have a drink while under antabuse, you'll have a violent, sick reaction. So there's all kinds of pharmacological tools to help people stay clean, but the important thing is that they're not the panacea. It's part of a whole spectrum of services to help someone with this disease.
So when somebody comes to your door, and I've sent people there, it's whatever hour, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, and they have no idea that there's going to be somebody waiting for them. They just go, well, this is after hours, isn't it? What do I do? When somebody has that moment and they say, you know what? I have to do this right now. I saw somebody in your facility the other day that interrupted a meeting, just walked in the meeting, bless his heart. He had the guts to say it. He walked in, looked at one of your senior staff members and says, you have to get me in right now, please, right. And they did. What goes on? Tell us about, because that may be enough to get some people to pursue getting clean. What is it that they do? How does this function? The people who really need it, I think a lot of them have no idea where to start.
I agree with you, although personally, I think it's the most beautiful moment in a human's life. And for me, I've really had two lives. I had this life where I thought I was a working family guy who just really liked to drink. And then I've had this other life where I've been free from the bondage of alcohol, and I didn't realize the effect it had on me and how useful I could be, how happy I could be. We call it happy, joyous, and free. And that moment was really just this one second where I decided I was out of ideas and I wanted to try this. And our staff, whether it's on the phone or the internet or coming in, we recognize that 24/7, if that epiphany occurs, we have to be there to talk them through it, to help them, because, right after they decide, they remember they have to feed their parakeet tomorrow, or all hosts of reasons that they have to go. And we have to be able to help them through that, utilize their family support system to help them through that, and enable that to make it happen.
So up top, you talked about the shift in your field from alcohol and cocaine over to opiates.
Yeah.
And I think we've all read the book Dreamland that came out a couple years ago that basically describes kind of a two-pronged approach to the roots of the opiate epidemic. The first being inexpensive, widely distributed heroin, largely coming up from Mexico, and the other one being some of the big pharmaceutical companies heavily marketing opiates and pushing them and getting them out there. And those two separate things kind of worked together to launch the opiate problem. Do you basically agree with that? Is that the way you see that? Is that the way you see it?
I 100% agree that it had a compounding effect to create a perfect storm. And it's why most of the worldwide opiates are consumed in the United States. It was both a distribution issue and a supply issue from Mexico, as well as the pharmacological companies working with physicians and encouraging them or enticing them to overprescribe. And it's created the problem that we have today.
Everyone's got to read that book, Dreamland, if they haven't already. Extremely well reported and
Las
very
Vegas
insightful.
has a big hand in
Las
that
Vegas
book
plays
as
a big
well.
role in it.
There's the one thing that they uncovered, and it's a stomach-turning moment, perhaps the biggest lie. Well, maybe not a lie, maybe a misstatement, an honest misstatement of this century, and that is that there was a less than 1% addiction rate from Oxy. And all it really was, that was taken out of context. They were in a pain clinic, and there was always a concern about addiction. And the writer was making an observation, and that was in a strictly controlled environment, watching intake within patients, not people staying at home reporting the drugs that they were taking. That by carefully monitoring, that he had attained an addiction rate of less than 1%, is what he was saying. That was taken by the makers of the drug and exploded because at that time, doctors, American doctors specifically, were being accused of undertreating pain, of not recognizing real pain and the damage that it did to psyche and to people's lives and their ability to go on with their work. Well, that was a perfect excuse. Now they could prescribe all the drugs in the world. No one's going to get addiction. Yet here we are all these years later. Everybody knows precisely how addictive it is, and doctors are writing prescriptions with both hands. How is that allowed to continue?
Well, two things to clarify. One, that SAMHSA points out that 9.2% of Americans have this propensity to addiction. So the number's not 1%. It's closer to 10%. The other issue is, Tyler and I were talking before we started, his back hurts. I'm 54 years old. Multiple things hurt on me every morning when I wake up. And just the fact that there is some pain is part of life that we need to go through. Yeah. And the answer isn't, when my elbow hurts, that, I need a narcotic right away to help address it. There's a variety of other things, and then part of it is dealing with it.
Not to mention, for back pain specifically, I understand that opiates are not a good solution at all, unless you need it for 1 or 2 days to get out of bed. But as far as long-term or any length of time extended past that it's not the ideal situation at all. Even though for years and maybe still it was being pushed in that direction.
Opiates are FDA approved for acute pain. They are not approved for chronic pain. If you're using opiates for more than 6 months, for more than a year, you're going to develop tolerance. You're going to need more of the substance to achieve the desired results. You're going to develop withdrawal symptoms if you don't have those opiates. So yes, there's a recent study that came out showing that ibuprofen is more effective at helping treat back pain without some of those adverse circumstances that we've been talking about.
In Europe, they, and it may have been part of the same study that you're talking about, but throughout Europe, they asked doctors, they would take an injury posed to a U.S. doctor and a European doctor, what would you prescribe for pain? And everything in Europe was aspirin, ibuprofen, acetaminophen. That's it. That's as far as it went. And the outcomes, the patient's pain levels were precisely the same. At no risk. Maybe, it's not the best thing in the world for your liver. Acetaminophen and aren't the best thing in the world for your liver taken over time. But other than that, they weren't being addicted. Their lives weren't being destroyed. An entirely different approach. I know doctors who have treated patients that ask for refills of large quantities, and if you look that patient in the eye, without any question they haven't taken a drug in 10 years. It's going right out that door and it's being sold because there are people, that is their retirement. Mm-hmm. That is their retirement, and they make a ton of money just off of getting a refill.
When I worked for a large insurance company in town, we would do utilization review of some of the pharmacy use. And we'd see some clients when we'd actually run the reports and look and say, we don't have an opiate use problem. We have an opiate distribution problem with some of the amounts that were being utilized.
How much does like a pill go for on the street these days?
Well, that's part of the problem. The big milligrams go for the equivalent of $50 to $100, and heroin's 10. And heroin whips the over the counter every day. The only advantage is the pill is so hard to construct that you can't very well counterfeit it. So you know exactly what you're getting. Heroin, the only thing they have to rely on, and this is a rather sad thing, but the Mexican distribution network has an excellent reputation for purity. And if you get a bad batch of drugs, according to Dreamland, they will happily replace the amount of balloons that you have left without any problem. Moreover, they're expert at re-engaging former addicts. So one of the most important things that they do, their marketing begins when they go into a new city, is they will go to drug rehab. They will go to a line where people are being prescribed methadone in the morning, and they go as early as possible in the morning because they know those people have jobs. They will hand them a balloon with a phone number on it, free drugs, stick it in their hand. By the time the person sees what it is, that person is gone down the street. The dealer knows this person has the wherewithal. What are you doing up at 5:30 in the morning? Well, you're getting ready to go to work. And they re-addict them. And it's a terrible, terrible thing. They're almost impossible to catch now.
That's unbelievable.
Let me ask you about your practice at Solutions Recovery. Specifically, what if someone wants to reach out, take that first step for themselves, for a loved one, toward recovery? What's the very first thing they do? What's the process? What if they're worried about insurance? Can you walk us through the first steps to take to reach out for someone who might want to do that?
Thanks so much for asking. I just say, please call us. We have a 702-228-8520 number. We answer 24/7. My number is also readily available on my social media. I'll make it available. My personal number. I'm happy to talk to someone to try to help them. Like I said, I think it's the most beautiful moment in a person's life because it's really the beginning of a second chance to live an even better life. In many diseases, if you have heart disease and you go get surgery or you get something, the doc will tell you you're 80% as good and functioning as you were before. When you get your life back from addiction, you end up being better than you were before, and it's such a beautiful thing to see. So I encourage people just to call us or call another treatment center or, like the Nevada 211 number. Call someone to get immediate help.
One thing to all those employers out there, people who do get clean and have been through rehab, you hear this over and over and over again. They're some of the best employees you'll ever have because they're scared to death to skip a day at work or to come in late or anything else. They're really, really dedicated. Like you said, some people throw themselves into their work forever after that.
And many are conscientious, thoughtful, caring, and don't have clouded judgment from having one too many last night.
All of those other things. Is Las Vegas a particularly tough place for addiction?
I don't think so. I think that 9.2% number that I mentioned, it's generally the addicted population nationwide. Now, I do believe Las Vegas gets some of the most acutely addicted people. Like when I talk to treatment centers in Salt Lake or in Phoenix, they'll tell me they'll get people coming in drinking a pint or drinking a fifth. At Solutions, we'll get people drinking a half a gallon a day. I'll get people taking 50 to 75 benzodiazepines a day. I've had people taking 100 opiates per day, and I'm thinking like a cereal bowl full of pills. So some of the acute nature of the addicts that we get might be more so, but I think the addiction rates are pretty similar.
Wow.
We've talked so much about the opiate crisis today. What is the trend looking like? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel with this? Are we as a society making any progress whatsoever? I hate to think it's as hopeless as some people make it out to be, but perhaps it is at this point.
I appreciate the work y'all are doing by spreading the word, because people are becoming more aware of this problem, and we say that the first step is recognizing you have a problem. So I do appreciate that the United States is becoming more aware of it. Unfortunately, when I look at overdose numbers, they're not coming down yet. So I do believe it will come down,
right,
but we still have the lion's share of work to do.
Yeah.
One interesting development that has come up is that cities across the country, municipalities across the country, counties across the country, states, are now suing the drug manufacturers, opioid drug manufacturers, to be at least in part made whole because of the additional police, the paramedic calls, all of these other things, and 1,000 other points that they come in contact with the government. One of the holdouts so far, and I guess there's a hearing coming up in the city of Las Vegas
next week.
How important is that? How important is it that somebody stands up to these companies and says, this is just going to cost you. It's going to cost you too much. Don't do this anymore.
I personally am anti-litigation, and I think we've become too litigious as a society. However, when I look at the tobacco use in the U.S., I believe the tobacco lawsuit was the single biggest effect in reducing the amounts. I believe the opiate lawsuits will be the single biggest effect in reducing opiate use. So I'm on the bandwagon. We need to take the folks who used dishonest, inappropriate, unfair marketing practices to push a harmful, addictive drug, and we need to hold them to justice.
That is a good parallel. I mean, if the tobacco lawsuit got results, which it did, you've got to think the opioid lawsuits will have somewhat of a similar result.
And this is more direct. You smoke a cigarette for 20, 30 years before you get cancer. You use an opiate for 3 to 14 days before you start having signs of physiological dependence.
How about, I don't think it's been in the news too much lately, but you used to see a lot of politicians, and they would talk about just legalize everything, because if you legalize everything, people won't use it, or they'll use it in a more controlled fashion. So you hear about
that's the old
countries
Ron
like
Paul approach.
You hear countries like Canada where they have like state-sponsored like Skid Row, or they'll provide disposal stations and clean needles and everything. Does that even work? I mean,
it's a fair question. Portugal is another example where they've allowed open access, and to me, there's a variety of issues. Although they do have some successes there.
Sometimes the solution is like the craziest idea in the room, but I don't hear much about it anymore as to whether the numbers are actually improving in some of those countries, like if addiction has gone down or the overdoses.
I have a teenage son. And sometimes he'll point out somebody drinking. He'll say, look, they're drinking a glass of wine. They're bad. And I'll say, no, son. It's fine for them to drink. It's just not okay for me to drink. I think the same thing about drugs.
Yeah.
I personally am allergic.
I keep hearing that there are successes and I'm looking up a name real quick, but I keep hearing that there are successes in those other countries, and you say that you don't hear it as much anymore. But among the names is President Bill Clinton, Richard Branson. There's some big names in business that say, look at this model, get containment on it, and with the time between use and rehab will be much, much tighter because people know who's doing what when. The Brits undertook a long time ago. They were handing out free heroin to registered heroin addicts. And then in Keith Richards' book, he said somebody had the bright idea that said, these guys are laying around all day. Let's give them free cocaine, which had everything to do with the way music went after that, because cocaine and music go together so well. There is this overlap where you can look at 10 years in the Western world, and cocaine was king for those 80s. Before that, as we said, it was you went through a bunch of depressants, Seconal, and these other things. Before that, it was hallucinogens. It looks like there's a big cycle. Are we still on that, where we go on to the next thing and go on to the next? Is cocaine making a comeback? Or are these other drugs making a big comeback?
I am not seeing a resurgence in cocaine use at our specific treatment center.
And you'd be the first to know. That would be you'd hear it.
We see one demographic. It's interesting when I talk to my criminal justice friends, they still believe methamphetamine is a bigger problem. And actually, if you're using crystal meth, the chances are of you being involved in the criminal justice system, I think, is higher.
Much higher, yeah.
While if you're in Summerlin or Green Valley, it's more likely you're going to be utilizing opiates. So there's a demographic utilization of substances.
What has the advent of medical marijuana and recreational marijuana done to rehab in general?
Unfortunately, that's another graph that is skyrocketing. 5 years ago, I had never treated a patient for cannabis use. We now have many clients calling us who are reporting all kinds of daily physiological dependence, and we're treating them. And the amount of THC in marijuana nowadays is much more potent, and the amount of clients we're getting in, and we're calling their insurance companies, reporting their criteria, and they're approving days to have these clients treated. I believe that's the next wave past opiates. I believe the United States is getting ready to have a marijuana epidemic, because just like alcohol, where 9.2% of the population is going to have this propensity to become addicted to it, I believe the numbers are going to be similar with marijuana. And as we legalize and then somewhat promote it, we're going to have more use, and some percentage of the people are going to fall to addiction.
I will say this. I know this. I differ with you on that one. But you're the guy in the know in that regard. But I will say this. I believe that edibles are going to have very, very strong controls on them eventually, because the human body responds in a completely different way. If you want to get sick as you've ever been in your life, that's the way to do it. I can't imagine a small child, a small animal getting a hold of a large edible, an amount of edible. I think it's an entirely different drug,
I agree with you. There certainly needs to be labeling and information shared. And we're in its infancy of distributing these drugs, and I believe there will be more controls. I'm not a big fan of controls, but I do believe more information needs to be provided about them.
In a country such as ours, where everybody is so just obsessed with excess and wanting more and as much of everything as possible, I unfortunately don't see your business slowing down at all in the future. I mean, you could be very much right with marijuana. It's just the next thing. It's just going to constantly be another revolving thing that people are just going to find an addiction to and just obsess over.
We have 450 beds, and like I said, we treat thousands of people. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing I would like more than to educate our community and to put me out of business. But I agree with you, in the short term and even in the midterm, I don't see an end to this problem.
No.
September will be here before we know it. September is Recovery Month. Mm-hmm. What does that mean to you, and how will you be marking that at Solutions Recovery?
Oh, wow, thanks for asking. Yeah, as I mentioned, recovery is a really important thing to a person who has found recovery, and I think it's important that, as a country, we celebrate it. There's a variety of events that occur in the month of September. I'm also the president of the Southern Nevada Association of Addiction Professionals, which is a subsidiary of NADAC, and we're having a big event at Solutions on the 14th. It's going to be a 6-hour symposium where we have some really interesting speakers, where we have a methadone doc, a buprenorphine prescriber, a naltrexone prescriber, a hardcore abstinence person, and we're going to have a news anchor ask them questions, and we're going to then, have some spirited discussion, because each of the different disciplines, they believe theirs is the right way, when each of us knows there's different ways for different people. So I really look forward to that event, but there's other events in the community that'll be announced later.
Well, I got to tell you, I think that the work that you're doing is some of the most important thing that we can do as a society. I know that it's not a panacea, that once in rehab, sometimes it takes 2 times. That doesn't mean that you failed. It just means that you had to take another bite of the apple. It's as simple as that. How many times, average, do you see people having to return in order to walk? And I know some people walk away after 4 days and they're done, and they're never going back to anything. It's just the nature of it. But how often? How often does it take?
If I tracked our rates from our clients that came in, it's something less than two times, although if I had leukemia and I went and I got a 90-day course of treatment and it went into remission and then it came back, and then I'd been back to the oncologist and it's now 6 times and my leukemia came back, would anybody be mad at me for saying I got to go back to the doctor again?
No.
That's the person, everything to do with the person. It's good to know that there are institutions here in town that can help us, because if anything, this is a moment of weakness. This is the ultimate moment of weakness, and if there's not somebody there to catch them, it's not going to be a pretty outcome.
But we could throw the rope. They got to grab the rope so we could pull them in.
I hear you. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. With that, we call it a day. The Vegas Legal Podcast. I do want to sincerely thank David Marlon, CEO of Solutions Recovery, Tyler Morgan, publisher of Vegas Legal Magazine, Jeff Haney, Vice President of Fiero Communications, Inc. Remember to like and share the Vegas Legal Magazine podcast on Facebook, and also catch us on YouTube, iTunes, or my personal favorite, Stitcher. And for all of you out there with a story idea, or an axe to grind, get a hold of Vegas Legal Magazine, the leading magazine in Southern Nevada legal market. You can call Tyler at
702-222-3476.
Reach out, tell us, tell your friends. We're out of here.